Hey everyone, Anarch here. So this is another in the series of videos that I'm calling Anarch Abridged, where I attempt not to be too long-winded and talk about some kind of concept which interests people in the community. And this one is going to be an intro to anarchism, which I am assuming will be pretty popular, or rather people will have a lot of use for it. Before I get started, I'd like to remind everyone to go become a patron at my Patreon. I'm trying to derive my primary income from the channel, and if you go become a patron, you can help me do that. So I think I'll just kind of get started describing anarchism at the simplest level that I generally explain it to people at. And that is that anarchism is the opposition to hierarchical power structures. Okay? Now, this has been stated in perhaps a simpler form, which is that anarchism is the opposition to relations of domination. Okay? And I think perhaps all of us are familiar with what I mean when I say domination, right? Which is when there is an extreme power differential between two different people. One person has the ability to exploit or manipulate the other person to control or command their actions. So anarchism is a political ideology that is predicated around opposition to those kinds of relations. So you might ask, well, why don't I use that definition? Why don't I use the definition involving domination? Well, the reason why I don't use that definition is because I think it's important for us to emphasize that what we're really opposed to is hierarchical power structures. That is to say, the establishment of systems of domination. It's more even than that we want there to be no domination in an interpersonal sense, which generally that is bad. Or that we want there to just be immediately the elimination of domination, because unfortunately that's pretty much impossible. It's instead that we are trying to destroy hierarchical power structures, power structures which are pyramidal in nature. Okay? So that's sort of the simple beginning definition. And that definition is good to get you started. To give you an idea of what people mean when they say they are anarchists. And the reason I like this focus as well is because this allows us to talk about the widest variety of different kinds of anarchists as well, while also not including forms which I would say are not anarchism. For example, anarcho-capitalism. So this brings us to what I think is maybe one of the next really important subjects to talk about if we're just like having an introduction to anarchism. And that is, there are really like majorly two schools in anarchism, and a third, which I'll talk about in a moment. These two schools are social anarchism and individualist or egoist anarchism. Now, some people reject this distinction. I'll explain why I don't think we should reject this distinction and why it's useful here in a moment. But first, I'll just kind of give an overview of what I mean in these two different schools of anarchism. So the social anarchist generally predicates their politics around these principles of freedom, equality, and solidarity. Okay, these are the driving values of the social tradition of anarchism. And I could expound on what each of those values are, but the thing I would really want to emphasize is just that you shouldn't be trying to consider those values alone when you try to understand them. You should only be trying to understand them when considered with one another. That is to say, we're not just trying to maximize freedom for its own sake. We're not trying to just maximize equality for its own sake. We're not trying to just maximize solidarity for its own sake, because if we were to just maximize those to the exclusion of the other values, we would miss everything about what anarchism is actually about, or social anarchism is actually about. Instead, what we're saying is that you should simultaneously consider the values of freedom, equality, and solidarity together. How, what kind of system, what kind of society would result in us holding all three of those values as our central values, okay? So we could expand on what is meant by freedom and equality and solidarity, but I'm just gonna bracket that one for now because there's just a lot to be said about it. As with a lot of things I'm discussing here, I think that if you are really interested in a broader coverage of this topic, of these ideas, you should go watch the series that I am currently developing called A Modern Anarchism. And currently, as of creating this video, I've created 2 of the parts, but it is planned to be a 4-part series. And I think you'll find that just parts 1 and 2 will answer the majority of questions you'll probably have as you proceed through this intro video. But moving on. So the other big school of anarchism is what you might call individualist or egoist anarchism, okay? So individualist or egoist anarchism is focused on 2 different values. These values that they call the unique and ownness. So, you might find people using the different translations of these. They might, instead of using the unique, they might say the ego. And instead of saying ownness, they might say property. Okay, so these are just 2 different translations of Stirner. Stirner mostly would use these sorts of phrases interchangeably, but he would be referring to the same ideas. So the unique is essentially those ineffable properties of the individual, those aspects of their identity which cannot be encompassed or encapsulated in words, right? That sort of aspect which makes them what they are, each thing, right? So then what is ownness? Ownness is this concept of like apprehension, the ability to like utilize the world. So the reason why I've defined these 2 and I didn't really define the previous 3 is you probably at least have like some inkling of what I meant by freedom, equality, and solidarity. Like you at least can kind of infer what I might mean. However, probably you have no idea what I mean when I say the unique and ownness. So I'm purposely explaining those so that you can kind of understand what they mean. And what you might find a lot in this tradition is it is very predicated around like freeing the individual from arbitrary aspects of society which socially and psychologically condition people. So the rejection of stultifying boundaries, of labels, of ideologies that lead to the confounding of self-interest. Okay. By contrast, the social anarchist was focused around the creation, as you might imagine, given the inclusion of the word solidarity, of a strong solidaric society, of creating a society based around cooperation, wherein people have equal access to power, wherein people are free to expand and to explore and to bring to the full development their abilities and capacities. Okay. So with this, I feel like we've pretty well summarized what these 2 schools are about. And I think what you'll find, now that you may have some at least passing familiarity with these 2 schools, you're probably kind of familiar with anarchists you've interacted with that fit into one or another of these schools. You might have some experiences now that you can think back on and be able to discern where you may have had kind of different conceptions of anarchism given to you before this. And I think you'll find that they correspond pretty well to people that are in those 2 different schools of anarchism. Now, I also said that there was a sort of third school. And this third school, I would say, is synthesis anarchism. Now, my conception is that synthesis anarchism is mostly a philosophical perspective, which is supposed to be mediation between the two schools, less than it is, say, a holistic school of its own with its own values. It's not, I would say. It's instead perhaps an attempt to translate between the two tendencies to help them come to an agreement with one another. You'll find that a lot of the key writers of synthesis anarchism are trying to help the two schools stop talking past one another. Because synthesis anarchism was rising as a key part of the movement, it was a response to really just very vicious political campaigns taking place. And I don't mean, of course, like electoral campaigns, but posturing and attempts to destroy one another. Taking place in especially like the very early 1900s. This even escalated to violent conflict at times. Okay, so the synthesis anarchists saw that it was very important for them to try to mediate this conflict because it was getting way, way out of hand. And in fact, it did get out of hand numerous times. Malatesta, for example, was shot by an individualist anarchist who criticized individualist anarchism too much. And Malatesta famously wouldn't turn him into the police and refused to invite punishment or to encourage punishment of the person who shot him. He was overall very permissive of what took place, but sometimes it was very vicious. There were even occasions where there was armed conflict between the two factions. It was not common, but it did take place from time to time. So. Here's what I want to say. There's often this very natural response, once this has been described, to say, well, why do those two schools need to disagree with one another? Synthesis anarchism just seems obvious. And perhaps that's true. I'll let you explore all of this on your own. You get to decide which of these tendencies and which of these schools of thought are the ones that will be interesting to you. I'll preface by saying I am a social anarchist. You'll find that that's the case throughout my work. If you just go look at the rest of the work on this channel, you'll find that I am very much a social anarchist. But the split really takes place not because the social anarchist rejects individualism or rejects the uniqueness of individuals or rejects the desire for individuals to expand their individual powers. Nothing of the sort. In fact, you'll find that the social anarchists are very receptive to having discussions about the value of individuals and of the need to cultivate uniqueness and cultivate individual freedoms. Okay, that's something that's understood well by the social anarchists. It's just not their main emphasis. So the social anarchist already regards that the social and the individual must be thought of and conceived in order for us to properly understand how anything works. Okay, the problem is that the individualist anarchism does not concede the need for solidarity, does not conceive the need to try to cultivate a social freedom, but instead only wants to do that under the conditions that it acts in their self-interest. And that's a much bigger discussion, which I do not intend to mediate or discuss too much further in this video. But it is, once again, as many things we will discuss, something that I do discuss in much more depth in A Modern Anarchism, especially part 2 of A Modern Anarchism. So let's talk. Let's kind of, go afield a little bit. Let's go a little bit more in depth now. We kind of laid in some of the foundations, like what does somebody mean when they say they're an anarchist? What kinds of anarchists are there? There's all kinds of schools inside of all those tendencies. If those are Venn diagrams, they contain a bunch of smaller circles in which there's smaller circles inside of that, and so on and so on. Okay, but that's not where I really want to go. What instead I want to do is kind of now give you more context about what anarchism is, okay? And help kind of push back against some of the vulgarizations or some of the simplifications that take place, and maybe like ground you a little bit in the history of what anarchism is, okay? So one of the first things that happens is when somebody hears the word anarchy or anarchism or anarchist, this immediately means to them like chaos, structurelessness, lack of rules, lack of order, right? That is a false understanding. Okay, that understanding is arising from number one, propaganda against anarchists, okay, historical propaganda against anarchists, but also, as Malatesta points out, it's a misunderstanding that arises from the fact that anarchists are saying, I don't want to be dominated. I don't want a hierarchical power structure to control my life. And when people hear that, sadly, and I find this very sad, but their natural inclination is to say, well, and if we aren't dominated, then everything will be chaos. Okay? If there is no state to point guns at our head and tell us to follow laws, we won't follow laws and we'll all eat each other alive. Okay? So this is the real core of the misunderstanding of anarchism, right? This idea that what anarchists are saying is get rid of the state, get rid of, hierarchical power structures and so on, and just everything will work itself out. Okay? Now, it might be the case that there are some anarchists that do kind of feel that way, but that is the minority opinion. What you will find is the majority of anarchist works push back against that conception. Okay? It's not that we want nothing in place of the state. We want nothing in place of private ownership and corporations and so on. It is instead that we wish to replace it with a solidaric society. So you might say, and this is the phraseology I use, this is the way I describe it, that we want to instead establish horizontal power structures as opposed to hierarchical power structures, which are pyramidal. We want to create power structures where power is distributed among a very large group of people, ideally the entire populace. Okay? So this makes sense of this value of equality in social anarchism. What we're talking about is the equality of structural power. Okay, we're not talking about the equality of individuals. Okay, because no two individuals are the same. You can't conceive of every individual being identical. Okay, so we're not talking about equality of powers of individuals. You're never going to get all of the individuals to have equal powers. It's probably not even desirable to do so. Right? Do we really want everybody to only care about the same things and only be good at the same things? Of course not. Okay, and that's not what anarchism wants. That's not what any anarchist wants. Instead, what anarchists want is a diverse society where people have a diverse array of different powers, but that none of those powers, okay, and this is the key, that no power that a person has allows them the right to dominate other human beings. Okay? And further than that no structure ever be developed which privileges one of those powers such that having that power allows that person to dominate all the others that do not have that power. And this is an extremely important component of all of this. This is beginning to bring in the reasoning as to why solidarity is so important, okay? A society which benefits all of us is one where we all recognize a common struggle. And in the recognition of that common struggle, we recognize our mutual benefit in the expansion of a better society, the expansion of a society where we are all allowed to expand to our full capacities, to explore those things which make us what we are, those natural capacities that we have and those capacities that we desire to pursue over the course of our life. Okay? So anarchism wants to create the society that allows us to explore those as best as possible without any of those powers, without any of those capacities or desires allowing us to dominate one another. Okay? So I think we've laid in some pretty important groundwork at this point. Okay, I feel like if you understand everything I've said so far, you understand more than like 99% of people in the populace about what is meant by anarchism. So, I always limit myself to 30 minutes. So we're coming around to like the 20-minute mark now, and just let me say, I'm going to use it. And let's talk about some other things that are taking place here. Okay? So, anarchism is really an ideology that arose, I would say, if you root it back to Stirner, the early 1800s, but what we consider as a movement, as a political revolutionary movement, it really arose more in the mid to late 1800s. And it was really constituted as one of those many militant labor movements that arose around that time. So we're all kind of familiar with like revolutionary socialism and revolutionary communism and all of that. Well, at the same time the roots of all of that was being developed, so too were the roots of anarchism developing in the mid to late 1800s. And it was extremely coordinate with militant labor. So what that means is the roots of anarchism, what anarchism is inherently anti-capitalist. Okay, it arose as an anti-capitalist movement. Even its earliest progenitor, Joseph Pierre Proudhon, who was the first person to call himself an anarchist, even though he had more of a sort of like what's called mutualist or more kind of like a market anarchist perspective, it was still explicitly anti-capitalist. It was explicitly against private ownership of industry and instead desired to distribute ownership among laborers. So this is at the foundations of anarchism. And I think that's really important because I think if you are calling yourself an anarchist, but you do not have a militantly anti-capitalist perspective, you're probably wrong to call yourself an anarchist. Okay, anarchism is naturally anti-capitalistic. But I want to emphasize more than that if one really takes these principles, and now I suppose what I'm doing is I'm catching us up to the modern era, okay? If one really takes those principles seriously that have been discussed thus far in this video, that is an inherently intersectional conception, right? Hierarchical power structures aren't only built out by economic means. Hierarchical structures aren't only built out by means of the state. Hierarchical power structures and structures and relations of domination are built out by an enormous diversity of different kinds of things, okay? So if you go really far back, one they used to emphasize on a lot was religion. They would talk about how religion was used to brainwash large amounts of people, and anarchism was accordingly very anti-theist. Now, I think what you'll find is that, that is something where there's been a lot of questioning and exploration among the anarchists, and you'll find that, of course, there's a lot of exploration of different various kinds of like theistic or more sort of like supernaturalist metaphysical conceptions, spiritual notions have now started to find their synthesis with anarchism. You'll find Buddhist anarchism, Taoist anarchism, Christian anarchism, Hindu anarchism, all of it. It's out there. But I just want to say, if you go and start reading those old texts, you're going to find they're very anti-theist. Okay. Part of the reason why that's the case is that anti-theism was sort of like anti-clericalism, right? Which they could see was building out structures of domination and had been building out structures of domination all throughout like the feudal era. Right, that was like a default part of the critique of the left at that time, was how that those religions were being used in order to establish the structures of domination. So what one should infer from this is that anarchism is a much more broad spanning critique than a lot of the other critiques that are in the running here, okay? And that means that it very easily breaches into all of these other issues, such as patriarchy, or just the exhibition of misogyny in the interpersonal sense, white supremacy, or the inspection of racism in the interpersonal sense. And in the modern era has begun to especially proceed into these areas such as transphobia, ableism, a bunch of different topics like this. Okay, anarchism was always very much built to have this capacity to analyze any and all hierarchical power structures, any and all relations of domination. And so what that means is that anarchism has aged very well into the modern era. It has done very well at accommodating itself to an intersectional perspective. And once again, this is something you will find me inspecting in much greater depth in A Modern Anarchism, this topic, especially part 1 of the series. Okay? So what this leads us to is that anarchism is an extremely modern and enduring analytical framework, and it inspires an enduring revolutionary movement. Okay? Because it contains all of the critiques of the socialist and communist revolutionary movements. It just has them absorbed into its very default presuppositions. But it also has been extremely prepared to move into the modern era, where so much of how the power structure exists is taking place through things which are not explicitly and easily identifiable as economic relations of domination, or as just being relations of the state, and instead are starting to become much more subtle and nefarious, right? Like these concepts of like co-option, the idea of how media is used to deceive us and manufacture consent, as Chomsky says. And I think what you'll find is this makes anarchism extremely flexible to modern conditions, and that this is why that it is doing such a good job accommodating itself to all of these other identities which were not present at the foundations of anarchism's development, but have now found the value of the analytical framework of anarchism and are applying it to their circumstances. So what you'll find, for example, is that black anarchism is a very, very prevalent trend in anarchism. I would say that some of the most important works that are currently being written are being written among black anarchists. I attribute this to some degree to anarchism's capability to analyze such a diverse array of types of oppression. So I think we've gotten a pretty good coverage of the way I look at anarchism here, okay? But really the very last thing I would say is that I think it's most proper to understand that anarchism actually includes 3 distinct aspects, okay? It is, number 1, an analytical framework. It's a method of like picking out hierarchical structures, locating them in their existence, and then taking them apart and understanding how they function. Okay, I would say that's its mode of analysis, you might say. Okay, then it is also a method. Okay, it is also It is a series of mechanisms, a series of methods that we might use to dismantle those structures. It is an active impulse in the world, and it's also that opposition to hierarchical power structures more broadly that I just mentioned, okay? So there are also these 3 like really key principles, which are, I would say, like the defining principles of anarchism. They are that, number 1, means cannot be disentangled from ends, or we sometimes call this means-ends unity, okay? That all hierarchical power begets monopoly and domination. And third, that all power structures of any kind seek to perpetuate themselves. Okay? So if you take all of these things together, everything that I've mentioned in this video, I feel like you'll have a pretty solid understanding of the foundations of what anarchism is, okay? This is the broad range of tendencies that people who call themselves anarchists will abide by. I hope that this was informative for you. I tried my very best to explain what I think are relatively complicated concepts in a way that I hope made sense to people who are kind of at the layman level. And if you feel like I did a good job, comment below, tell me. If you feel like perhaps I kind of, used a little bit too much jargon, also feel free to tell me down in the comments. But in any occasion, once again, just as I sign off here, just want to encourage you to go become a patron at my Patreon. The script for the next video is already in development. It's already 11,000 words long. It will probably also take a really long time to finish, so expect to be seeing a lot of these Anarch abridged in the meantime. I also intend to do a live stream sometime relatively soon, which will be like a Q&A and also an opportunity for me to talk to people about part 2 of A Modern Anarchism. But anyway, stay tuned for all of that. I hope to talk with you all soon. See you later.